Hello and welcome back to the studio. Today, here's my reference. And here's the head I used for the facial painting or the portrait. Today, I'm going to show you how I got from that to that, and to that, and to that. And it's going to be a lengthy portrait session. Hopefully, you'll stick around to the very end, whereby I'll be showing you some tricks to use while painting your portraits. Now, here is my color palette that I'm about to show you. I have with me red crimson today, red crimson, ivory black, titanium white, yellow lemon hue, cobalt blue, burnt umber, and ultramarine blue. Those. And here is the brush that I'm going to use to make the sketch from the very beginning to the very end. Now I'm just going to place this reference right here on the top left corner as I map out where to place the first marks to find out the shape of the head. And as you can see, as I always mention, you have to hold the brush at arm's length. So this is why you're not seeing my face or head close to the canvas. They're further away because I'm giving myself room to actually see my figure wholesomely. I want to see everything as it is. I want to see the form all at once. I do not want to have tunnel vision. I want to see what's happening from the start to the very end. Now here I am sketching using a flat bristle brush. It's not a long handle brush. It is brief, and that allows me to have more control on the edges as I lay these lines in relation to the reference portrait, to the reference that I have. As you can see, I am slowly advancing, and I am nearing that level of satisfaction with the figure of the head, with the shape of the head. You see, ordinarily I'd begin with the background of any portrait, but for this one I'd like to just get straight to it and begin painting the figure, because I feel as though it's going to save me a lot of time as well. I mean, there are some pros and cons, but for today I just feel as though I just need to get straight to it. I can't wait for the background at this point. I just want to get to it. And it's allowed, it's art. You know, you can try something new. I'm not used to this. I don't do this as much, but today I'm going to do it for you and show you how it's done. Here is a brush loaded, ready to paint the first blocking layer. As you can see, I'm getting straight to a very bright tone here, and this is a mixture of a red crimson, titanium white, and a tad bit of burnt umber. Now I am gently mapping out where the blocking shapes are going. As you can see, I'm using large masses of paint, large tiles of paint, to actually get a read on what goes where. And I have chosen here to begin with the highlights instead of the midtones or even the cooler tones, the darker tones, that is. Now it's more of sculpting from the outside, like how Michael, or is it Michelangelo, used to sculpt his statues or, say, pieces from the outside in, revealing the shape underneath the block. Now I'm treating this canvas surface like a marble block. Now that is why I'm starting with the outside going inwards. The forehead is lifted and more to the outside than the creases of the eyes and under the nose and even the mouth and everything behind the ears or behind the face. Now as you can see here, I am now mapping out where the eyes are going to go and the side of the nose towards the left side of the face. This is very important because I have slightly reduced the tone here, and it's no longer me using the brighter tone. I'm using a more subdued tone that is a mixture of more of that burnt umber and a tad bit of deep yellow oxide. Now, as you can see here, I am briefly scribbling the surface and blending as I go because it is easier to see what's going on with the tones, and I am now beginning to connect two and two together, and there is a relationship between these tones at the end of the day. Two becomes one, and 1 plus 1 becomes 2. As you can see, it is now taking shape, and a sort of face mosaic is beginning to reveal its head. Now, this is in direct reference to what I have on the top left side of the screen. I am gently using my brush without overdoing things here. I am not over pushing my brush. I am not putting much of my weight on the surface. I am really trying to make everything reasonably done. And as you can see, I am briefly blending between the edges of the darker tones and the lighter tones. Not in the inside, just towards the outside of these edges. Now again, at the block in, you can use the wet on wet technique to kind of layer paint on top of wet paint. Now here nothing is dry, and I'm yet again using thick paint to come on top of that layer underneath and lift the tone a little bit after creating that, map of where I'm going to go with the facial features. At these early stages, it is permitted for the painting to look funny. I always say this, you don't have to look perfect from the very beginning. That is why I don't use early sketches within the facial area. I rather use masses of color. I'd rather use masses of color to find out where these features are going to go. Now for the hidden creases, for the darker creases within the eyes and under the nostrils, these are places I'm going to use darker tones. And then for the highlights are meant for the lifted bumps of the face, including the nose bulb, the cheeks, and just right under the nostrils, towards the skin areas that face the light. Now, I have to let you know that the full tutorial is going to be available on my website at thomasgeorgearts.com/store, and it is going to be 5 hours long, and it's not only going to speak about painting the face or the portrait. It's going to speak about painting the whole figure. It's going to be a figurative painting tutorial. That main video is where this session that we're having here was extracted. So if it weren't for the painting of the whole figure, we wouldn't have this portrait painting session. Now here on the side of the face, I am briefly pulling down the hair using more yellow. This is deep yellow mixed with a little bit of burnt umber and ultramarine blue to the very minimum to bring forth a tad bit of green that is very much hidden. And I ever so slightly vary my tones to make sure that I communicate the darker values, the midtones, and the highlights properly. This is the same principle I use from the very beginning of the painting to the very end, even with the hair. I do this to convey that three-dimensional space that the hair occupies, just as much as any other feature of the body would do. You have to begin with the tone of your selection. In my case, sometimes I begin with the darker tones and then the midtones and then the highlights, but if you choose to do, it is still permitted for you to be using first the midtones and then delineating between the highlights and the darker tones. But I always prefer to finish with the highlights. Now, the decision lies with you whenever you're working and with what you find easier to do or to start with. If you choose to start with a darker tone, good. And if you choose to start with a lighter tone or the mid-tone, good. So long as you know what you're doing. Now here, it is now beginning to take shape and things are boiling nicely. So far I haven't used any line to bring out any feature within the face. The face has three areas that could be very complicated or very easy depending on how you treat your tones: the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. Now here you can see I've just laid the masses, the tiles of paint on the lips, and then come on top of that with darker tones to kind of delineate, to separate the upper lip from the lower lip, because the upper lip casts a shadow to the lower lip. That's why the lower lip appears to be a bit darker than the upper lip. But then again, this is not the final layer, so it doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be how it's going to appear, or the color it's going to take, or the form it's going to take at the very end. You're still going to need to, shape some things up in later stages that we're going to talk about later. Now, as you can see, I can see a face coming through, but these are blocking, tiles of paint that are going to have to be blended to suit my intended blocking appearance. I'm using a pointed round brush here to kind of line out the eyes and see how the eyes are going to appear. It's simply like a roadmap. It doesn't necessarily mean as well that this is going to be the way it appears at the very end. Now on the side of the cheek, the right cheek that is, I've come with a darker tone here, and that's a mixture of burnt umber and red crimson, together with a little bit of ultramarine blue to kind of knock down the tone and make it darker, to take that shadow appearance, because that's not where the light is coming from. The shadow will be cast by the side of the cheek, such that there'll be dark appearing there. Now here, I'm simply playing around with my tones and, kind of mapping out things. So this is where, when I began, I didn't use any sort of sketch to kind of find out where the mouth is, where the mouth starts and where it ends, the borders and anything like that. Now this is where I do that, though it's not as obvious as you might think that it should be done. In my situation, I opt to just lay blocks of color, one on top of the other, wet on wet. Climbing up to the eyes, as I do not have no narrow vision, I'm working on the whole thing all at once. The face, that is. I can bounce between the nose, the eyes, and any other area I choose or deem fit. Now here, I'm dealing with the eyes to kind of just shape it, make it appear human-like, not real at this point because we're still blocking in and finding out what goes where. And I'm really paying keen, or should I say close attention to my reference to get it spot on. Though in most cases in my block-ins, I have to confess to you, I don't usually get everything correct in one go. That is the importance of the block-in. I can make all the mistakes I want here, but later, after I let it to settle down and maybe dry a little bit and I come with the subsequent layers on top for the modeling, I can notice mistakes that I made even while just looking at it and correct my mistakes in the later stages, which we will talk about in a bit. Now, right now, I'm beginning to blend using my smooshing brush, which is kind of round and soft, to, cover that looseness that I had earlier. This smooshing approach allows me to bring things together in a manner to help me see or, foreshadow what's going to come in the near future as I paint. Now, when smooshing, you don't have to necessarily go all in. You just have to strategically use your smooshing brush in between the lines or zones of tiles of color, in between, not all the way inside. So say you have like this part over here. I'm not going all in. I'm going to the side. As you can see, the borderline of the face, the cheek, and the shadow area. That's where I come with my brush and I smoosh right down the middle. So any zone, light, dark, warm, cool, I render just right down the middle and the borderline of the two. Now that's how I bring forth the realism aspect of things. Well, this being the block-in, I'm not necessarily gonna make it real from the very onset of this process, because this is just gonna be, say, my foundational layer that I'm gonna use to be the support system of my subsequent layers. It is very important for me anyway to do this right in order to capture the essence of the person that I'm trying to paint. Now, you might be thinking, TG, this lady of yours looks like some sort of ghost. How about we take it to the next level? And I just want to tell you, it is very important to be patient with your process. It can take many forms as you work. And in my situation, and in this painting situation, it's no different. I can admit that the painting looks kind of scary, but then again, it's just a stage, and it's meant to be gone through, You have to go through the stage before you get to the next stages. Now, for the hair, I'm also rendering between zones because I'm treating it like a sort of three-dimensional space, and I'm paying close attention to my contours. I'm following the direction of my earlier brush strokes as well. Now here I'm using darker tones. This is ultramarine blue and burnt umber mixed together to form this dark tone that I'm using to kind of map out the iris within the eyeballs. But then again, I'm just doing this to foreshadow what's going to happen at the very end or towards the end of my process. This is not necessarily how it's going to look. It might not resemble the reference photo at this point in time, but this is meant to change as you continue working. That's why I encourage you to stick with it. I usually tell my students that when you want to paint a painting, say like a portrait, you have to consider the fact that there's a background and there's a foreground. Now, the reason I began by painting the blurry part is because that forms the, further side of the background. The background involves the front side and the back side, right? Okay, back side came out wrong. The point being that the blurry side represents the part that is far away from view, and the more focused side, which is the front, represents the part that comes closer to the viewer. Now, as I've just mentioned, I've already painted a blurry background to support the foreground image that is this figure of mine here. Now, as we are focused on portrait painting, I am now laying the second layer for the face. This is the second layer after the block-in. As you can see now, this is the stage where now I'm beginning to really pay attention to my reference colors. At the earlier stages, I might have even used some other colors. I could have used blue at will, or even green. But now, it is very important for me to really observe the tones of the reference and try to mix those tones accordingly to really capture the likeness of my reference. As you can see, at this stage as well, it's going to be yet a wet and wet process. So wet on wet and large tiles of paint upon the surface of the canvas. Now that we have a proper foundation, which was the previous block-in stage, I can confidently lay these new brush strokes without fear of the canvas beneath showing through. Now, it is very common of me sometimes to not fear going for highlights first before dealing with mid-tones and darker tones. I'm simply, looking at my reference and observing my tones and using those very tones to establish the second layer. Now, even within this stage, you are still gonna have to blend between zones at times, as I have done there. And if you haven't noticed, may I point out that the left, is this the left? Yes, this is the left. The left side of the cheek has been widened a bit to mirror my reference. Because at the end of the day, the reference is a very important aspect of your painting. So you have to really pay close attention to your reference. It was narrower the other time, and now, having made that mistake of making it so narrow, I have to widen it because the reference demands of it. I am truly trying to capture the likeness of my reference. And that's usually a very important aspect for people that want to paint portraits, because in portraiture, you have to try your best to really capture the character and resemblance of your reference or your model or your sitter. Now here, as I said, the eyes were simply meant to foreshadow what was going to happen. Now here, as you can see, I've covered things up, or at least I'm beginning to cover things up, by paying close attention to my reference. And the face has to look as though it's of my reference. I'm just going to put this darker tone here. This is a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt umber to form that dark color. And now I'm going to come with more lighter, or should I say warmer tones, and lay on the side of the cheek here. It is very important for me to do this because I'm really trying to capture that three-dimensional space. I mean, three-dimensional form of the facial features. Now, as you can see, I come on top of the nose with a warmer color as well, and that helps me separate between the shadow area and the lighter areas. This alone is enough to form some three-dimensional feel for the nose and really lift the nose above the features that are below it, because the light catches the nose first before it casts its shadow upon the adjacent spaces beside the nose. Now I'm really paying close attention to my creases as well. The creases don't necessarily touch that light to a higher degree compared to really darker areas like under the nostrils. And these creases have to be delineated as well and given the right tonality depending on what you have on your reference. Now the side of the nose here, I lay burnt umber mixed with deep yellow and a tad bit of crimson, a red crimson. Now, as you can see here, I'm still using that wet on wet approach and laying my tones upon the canvas so as to really show you how things look even before I blend anything. They are still broad brush strokes. As you can see, this is not even close to a tiny brush that I'm using. This is broad, and I'm laying broad tiles of paint upon this layer so as to cover my second pass of painting this portrait. Now, I'm going to go to the left eye now, and always I keep stressing on paying close attention to your reference. So this part under the eyebrow looks a bit warmer than the right eye under the eyebrow. And because I've already figured that out, I'm just going to cover the eyes again, the left eye, and pull it further to the left side and make it bigger, or should I say wider than it was the other time. Now under the nostrils here, I'm going to lay a lighter tone, and this is like a very bright gray, a mixture of ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and a lot of titanium white, a lot more than those. So something like, say, if I were dealing with 5 out of 5, I'd say 4 parts titanium white and 1 part ultramarine blue and burnt umber. On the lips here, I'm dropping my tone using more burnt umber and red crimson to really bring that shadowy effect that is cast by the upper lip. Now, since I don't have any sort of tunnel vision ideology, I prefer looking at everything all at once. I'm going to work on the right eye here by creating a gray tone. And this gray is created by mixing titanium white and a tad bit of ivory black. That is what I'm using here to kind of, sculpt this eyeball into place. As I do that, I am looking at my reference very closely, and that is why I've placed it here for you to look at it on the top left side of the screen. I'll do the same for the left eyeball. It is very important to really look at your painting and see if it is doing something that makes sense for you. You know, there are times whereby when you paint, you feel as though something is just off, even when there's the element of doing things correct. You have to line things up. I see in portraiture there are problems of lining the eyes properly. One might seem a bit lower than the other, and that would be wrong unless the person actually looks like that, because you didn't create people, so it's not your place to judge. Here, I have lifted my tones and found out where the eyeballs are going to go, and used gray here. This gray is a mixture of ultramarine blue and very little burnt umber. And as I paint that on top of the white, naturally it's gonna become grayer than intended because it's still wet underneath. So that's why that looks lighter than usual, than it would look at the mixed surface. I'm going to do the same with the left here. Now, as you can see, some sort of character is beginning to come through. And let's just go back to that right eye that I just did. Look under the eyeballs. The tone is a bit darker than the rest of the skin that surrounds it. Why is it darker? Because on top of that, I'm going to come with a lighter tone to really show that skin that hoods the eyeball right above it. Now, as I sculpt this left iris, I'm paying close attention to the darker tones and the lighter tones as well. Tonality is very important. On top of it, I shall come with a darker tone to really nail the pupil. This is pure ivory black. And sometimes you don't have to use pure ivory black. You can use a mixture of burnt umber and ultramarine blue. I round it using this pointy brush. It's going to be a tiny little black circle, almost like a black hole, right in the middle of your eyeball. And I'm going to do the same for the right eyeball. Now, as I do that, some character begins to form, but notice it still looks kind of two-dimensional. That's why rendering is going to be important. It is just very significant for you to know what goes where. It can be a slow process, and it can take a little bit of time, but it is very important that you stick with it. Now, at this stage, notice I haven't rendered anything yet. It's all been about just laying those mass tiles of colors upon the surface to know what goes where. Now, with this round Bristol brush that is also meant for smooshing, but occupies a much narrower space because it's a smaller brush, I come and begin rendering my zones. Now those broad brush strokes that I laid earlier on this second layer, I begin rendering them anew. Rendering is a very important part of realism. For the painting to look realistic, you don't have to stress too much on rendering from the very beginning. As you can see, my rendering comes much later, after establishing my tones and values and temperatures. I do the same for the eyeballs. It's no different. For the pupil to look natural and organic, you have to render its edges alongside the values that surround the pupil. Everything is rendered into the next thing. Every element is rendered into the next element to enhance the softness and to subdue sharpness and to bring out the realistic feel that you intend to bring out. I have shown everything from the very beginning, and I hope even at this stage you understand what's going on. Now, at this larger area, I use a larger smooshing brush. It's easier that way because it saves me time. I do not use small brushes for larger areas. For larger areas, I use bigger brushes. So since this is the side of the lips and just under it, towards the chin, I use this brush to render this crease here into its neighboring zones. Everything has to be seamless, and everything has to be organic. Never force your hand. Let your brush do the talking. Now, I'm going to reinstate that dark outline towards the upper part of the eyeball. This is to communicate the eyelashes just above the eyeballs. Now, at this point in time, I have worked on the eyeballs and I'm satisfied with what I've achieved thus far. I shall now come with this pointy round brush and highlight these areas that catch the light further. These are what you'd call ambient light. Now, for ambient light, you could use your brightest tones within your whites and use those to communicate light that catches the skin first before shadow is cast on the other side. I do the same for the side of the lips, just as I have done for the eyes. I'm beginning to see some sort of realism coming through. This is the third layer, whereby we are still in the modeling stage. Because I could say, and I must have forgotten to mention, that the modeling stage began right after the blocking stage, and that was in the second layer. Now, even in the third layer here, we are still in the modeling stage because we are trying to really sculpt this form into reality. It is not only painting, it is not just painting. This is sculpting, and sculpting is a form of art too, a very beautiful form of art, and I admire sculptors. That is why I like painting as though I'm sculpting. I'm going to come with a darker tone here, and this is just meant to communicate that crease that is formed in the reference, formed as a result of the left side of the eye casting a shadow just below it. hence forming this crease here. Now just after that crease, there's some light towards the nose on the left side. And might I prepare you, this crease here, that is just a mixture of burnt umber and red crimson, is going to be rendered into surrounding areas and make it very soft to communicate that realism that we're looking for. Because if you leave it like this, it won't look organic. It won't look natural. It'll look as though it is forced. It'll look like a sort of drawing that I don't want. It'll look like an unwanted mark. Now, on the forehead, I have to add some more ambient light to communicate the realism on the forehead and to bring some sort of softness that I'm looking for as well. Gently, I scribble my brush across the surface, as you have seen, and this helps to enhance the realism. Now, I'm going to go to the hair here. The hair still needs some highlights, which I'm adding right now. And these highlights, I'm just adding them on the outline to communicate the areas that the light catches more before getting all the way in. Now these sharp edges or hard edges on the hair are going to be rendered to make it a more smooth looking surface and more three-dimensional. I'm going to eliminate any sense of forced realism here. But might I prepare you, I'm not going to complete painting the hair in this session. The hair will be completed much later in another video, but I hope you can see thus far that the face indeed looks so much like the reference. Might I add, at this point I'm really enjoying the process because, there's that fulfillment that I get in my heart when I see a painting taking the form I intend for it to take from the very beginning. I've respected my values. I've respected my darks, my midtones, and my highlights. That's why the face looks as though it's a proper face. This is the skill I really aim to teach my students. Anyone I've ever taught my technique was first intrigued with the result that I usually get before anything else. Now, this is the thing I usually pass on to people that would like to learn from me. Realism is a beautiful thing. I love realism. It's not necessarily hyper-realistic, but I'm using the quality of paint to really communicate realness in life. Now this is a resulting figure whose process will be shown in my Patreon and my website tutorial. And I just wanted to show it to you because it is very important for you to not only master the painting of the face, but also master the painting of the whole human figure. Now this part is very important. If you feel as though you are stuck and you want to move to the next level, apply for a one-on-one coaching call with me. The link is down below. This free 30-minute coaching call with me will be centered around you, because honestly I prefer to build a program that makes you build your art and improve your general painting experience dramatically within the shortest time possible. I'll get to understand what frustrates you the most about your art progress, and I'll also understand what it would mean for you to paint something that actually moves people. And my question is this: if you had a magic wand, what would your career look like in 6 months? Your art career, that is. More like a month, because this process will take a little time and you shall improve your art dramatically. Also, I have a waitlist. Why is joining my waitlist so important, I hear you ask? Here, I get to treat you like a subscriber on my website. You get to hear of these YouTube tutorials and free tutorials on my website ahead of anyone else. Thank you for watching, and I can't wait to see what you create. See you on the next one.